Okay, over here.
Jennifer, I put these waters here for
Oh,
you.
thank you. I got one already. Thank you so much. My nose always run a little bit.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 6th Institute for Practical Ethics keynote. My name is Elizabeth Simmons. I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor of UC San Diego, and I am really delighted to be here to join you for an important discussion about climate change and socially conscious science. Our global ecosystem of innovation keeps growing and getting more complicated on the one hand and more interdependent on the other hand, and also in some ways more fragmented. And this means that as new areas of research are done and as new innovations are tried, it is more and more likely that they're going to have ripple effects that impact other parts of the world, other fields, but it may be less and less likely that we would know about that because of the fragmentation. And that's why it's so important that we come together in interdisciplinary gatherings so we can try to weave some of this back together and really understand what's going on. Throughout our history, UC San Diego has been really dedicated to tackling some of the biggest challenges facing the world and to taking a truly interdisciplinary approach. And the modern age of climate change research really was initiated at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and we have the Vice Chancellor for Scripps Institution of Oceanography right here with us, Margaret Leinen. Let's give her a round of applause. And the university over the years has really continued to develop as a global leader in the field of climate change research through cross-disciplinary work in many different areas that have advanced our understanding of different facets of climate change research to the point where now I can say with confidence that every single one of our 12 academic schools at UC San Diego is engaged in some way in issues around climate change, whether through scholarship, through innovation, through creative activity. Even some of our undergraduate colleges are dedicated to topics around climate change. And that's, I think, something that we can be really proud of, both as a research institution and as an educational institution. So I think we would all agree that knowledge brings power. And as Spider-Man and predecessors going back centuries, depending on exactly how you want to trace the words, remind us that with power comes responsibility. And so it is our responsibility to truly understand what is going on in climate change, what are the causes, what are the ripple effects, what are the ways that weave all of this together. And so conversations like the one that we're going to have tonight are especially important. So I thank all of you for being here today. And I want to now introduce another wonderful colleague, the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Cristina Della Colletta, who is going to continue the introduction. Cristina.
And thank you for the introduction, Elizabeth. I'm delighted to be here tonight with you all for what is sure to be a fascinating talk. At the School of Arts and Humanities, we center our research and education on several key values. One is ethical behavior. In fact, this value is embedded in a whole research institute. Launched in 2017, the Institute for Practical Ethics draws experts from the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences, and together they seek to answer the question, what is the ethical way forward? This institute would not have been possible without the generosity of Anne and Joel Reed. They established an endowment to support the institute's activities, including this important keynote event. Here at UC San Diego, researchers are creating new technologies, discovering medical treatments, and expanding scientific knowledge. And we are all working alongside them to explore both the opportunities and the risks associated with innovation. It is science for the common good. The topics we study are diverse. For example, we consider the ethics of gene editing, weighing the impact it could have on disease with potential unintended consequences. We investigate both the promises of big data as well as its effects on social inequities and misinformation. And we study how environmental justice can lessen the harmful effect of climate change. The Institute for Practical Ethics is co-led by two accomplished faculty members. Professor John Evans is a social scientist who studies scientific and technological development, including gene editing. He was recently named a Hastings Center Fellow, a prestigious group of scholars who shape a public understanding of complex ethical issues. John, let's give him a round of applause. And he is joined by Professor Craig Callender, a philosopher of science. Craig's work has ranged from exploring the nature of time to investigating environmental ethics. He recently served on the Freedom and Responsibility in Science Committee, part of the International Science Council, the largest science advocacy group in the world. Craig. So, Craig will be introducing our featured speakers for the evening, Jennifer Jacquet, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounced her last name. Her talk is part of the Institute's annual keynote speaker series. This series features presentations by scholars across the nation who are exploring important ethical questions. So thank you all for being here with us today, and please welcome Craig.
Thank you, Dean Della Caletta and EVC Simmons, for your support. This morning, Jennifer called me, and she said that she fell from her daughter's scooter, needed to go to the hospital, probably broke her arm, wouldn't be able to give the talk today. She then paused for a moment, let that sink in, and then said, "April Fools." Later, I was revived, and and I agreed it was a good joke. Now, it may be April Fools, but our speaker is no joke. Jennifer Jacquet is the professor of environmental sciences, science and policy at the Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science at the University of Miami, and also associate research director of the Climate Social Science Network at Brown University. Over the past 2 decades, she's become a force for positive environmental policy. I first became aware of her a long time ago. I was teaching in the Center for Marine Biology Conservation summer boot camp at Scripps Oceanography, and the students were complaining about my teaching, and that I was focused too much on, that environmental ethics was too much focused on land ethics, and that I need more marine ethics cases. And so then I was looking around, and then I saw that there was a graduate student at the University of British Columbia working with the eminent marine biologist Daniel Pauly on marine policy and ethics, and she was working then on transparency with seafood labels and that. Since then, she's become a major voice on the social science, ethics, and policy of industrial fisheries, animal welfare, agriculture, and meat and dairy production. Her book, Is Shame Necessary?, looks at the positive uses of shame as a way to encourage social cooperation. And in her book, The Playbook, she takes on the persona of someone advising dirty tactics so that you can manufacture opinion favorable to your product and delay regulation of any harms that it causes. Her dozens of articles trace out the often hidden and complicated social and ethical aspects of our elaborate food system and its environmental consequences. This work is having real-world effects. For instance, she's a major force behind the Octopus Act, which the governor signed into law this year, which prohibits octopus farming. A lot of her research is also important for climate litigation. In trying to affect policy, she has also appeared a lot in the media, such as in the film Changemakers with Ted Danson. She's also, this is completely tangential, but she's also spent time briefly, I think, in a jail cell with Ted Danson. Finally, Jennifer is a longtime friend of UC San Diego. In 2011, she co-taught with our great tropical ecologist, Jennifer Jacquet, at SIO. In this June, she returns to run the Disinformation Summer Institute with Naomi Oreskes, Jevin West, and me. Please join me in welcoming back to UCSD Professor Jennifer Jacquet.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Executive Vice Chancellor, the Deans for being here, to the Institute of Practical Ethics for having me. And I'll jump right in because I have a lot of slides, not a lot of time, and I know that it's April Fool's, a national holiday. We all want to get to where we need to go. I want to take seriously the idea of Exxon new, a phrase that many of you will have heard, and see just how applicable it is to the idea of Tyson knowing, the largest meat company in the United States. And I'm really interested in the concept of climate responsibility. What does it actually mean? I've been exploring responsibility for large-scale transboundary problems that span international borders, problems that no one country can solve on its own. And that has mainly been focused on global fisheries and the issue of climate change. I'm interested in patterns across these problems. And then within climate change, as you'll see from my talk, I'm really interested in how the playbook differs between industrial sectors. And most of all, I'm interested in the way that the kaleidoscope of scientific discovery, of empiricism, can shape and reshape our ideas of responsibility. And so sometimes you're looking at a problem and the way that you look at it shifts a little bit, and all of a sudden you've brought in a whole new set of actors who might be accountable or responsible in some way for shaping that problem. The most common way that we think about moral responsibility, though, and sort of the fundamental unit, I think, especially for philosophy, is the individual level. And there's a famous moral philosopher who's since died, unfortunately, Derek Parfit, who had this idea of the harmless torturer. He modified it a little bit into the idea of the harmless polluter. And it's basically the idea that you could have, he uses the case of Los Angeles, it's a good case, where people failed to repair the purifier on each of their cars, and no polluter by themselves makes much of a perceptible difference. But in some cases, not all, he lays out very, very distinctly problems where they are overdetermined or problems where actually if people change their behavior, it would be even worse than before. But he's interested in these cases. He lays it out in this essay in which if enough of us had acted differently together, we could have made the outcome better. And it's a nice idea. I think it's something that resonates with most of us, and it's something I want to circle back to in this talk today. But I was getting frustrated in the early stage of my career with the notion of individual responsibility for a lot of these problems. And the problem that I was most focused on, as Craig mentioned in his introduction, was the issue of overfishing. And so if you can't quite tell on the slide, these are those wallet cards that you can get at the aquarium that tell you which is the best choice and the worst choice for which fish to buy. And then there are all these logos like the Dolphin Safe logo or the Marine Stewardship Council logo, and they try to advise consumers in which way to direct their dollars and therefore save the oceans. And the first academic talk I ever gave in 2007 was at Scripps, invited by Jennifer Jacquet, and it was titled "Consumers Alone Can't Save Our Fish." And I laid out a bunch of reasons why, as I did in my dissertation, for the reasons why these tools wouldn't be able to work, that the problem was, in fact, overdetermined, as Parfit would have said. And that's because there are subsidies that keep fisheries active and afloat, producing the fish regardless of consumer behavior, the lack of traceability that Craig mentioned in terms of the labeling, consumer confusion about which fish were the best to buy, the absence of a price premium. And I sort of did this ad nauseum for a while, and I, again, also was looking across other kinds of large-scale problems for where consumers were being sort of targeted unsuccessfully for very little environmental change. And of course, climate change was also one of those. Maybe you'll remember in 2006, An Inconvenient Truth comes out. At the very end of that movie, which is a sort of giant tome of climate science, the first thing that was recommended was that you turn off your lights, that you recycle. These were things that were brought up at the end of An Inconvenient Truth. The EPA website on climate change, you can see, is focused on individual actions. And even oil and gas companies were really focused on individual responsibility. BP in 2004 published the carbon footprint idea. They advertised it repeatedly. This is a Chevron ad from 2008. It says, "I will unplug stuff more" across that advertisement. And this comes up all the way to the present. Just last year, Esso was running a campaign in the UK about car sharing and ride sharing, carpooling, and emphasizing individual responsibility. And that sort of makes one scratch one's head, when you're wondering about the effectiveness of this kind of frame or action. And now we're seeing that the CEO of Exxon is even making public statements about blaming consumers for climate change. And this is part of the legal strategy and legal defense in many of the lawsuits, is to redirect legal responsibility toward consumers, that these companies were merely meeting the demands. And there's also been some empirical evidence that suggests, and in contrast to Parfit's notion of individual responsibility, that individual action may actually come at the expense of systemic action. So a couple studies that have made me concerned. One involved 14,000 individuals in Japan that found that subjects that reported their energy savings were less likely to support a carbon tax. And another separate online survey, so bracket that with everything social scientists about those. But almost 2,000 individuals that they were recommended to change their behavior, so take fewer flights or carpool to work. And after that kind of frame, those individuals became less willing to report a willingness to take action to reduce greenhouse gases, less willing to vote for pro-climate candidates, and showed a reduced belief in anthropogenic climate change. I think this is something we must keep in mind, or at least should give us a little bit of pause as to how effective the individual responsibility frame may be. Another concern is that the individual frame distracts us, in fact, from other potential responsible actors. So here is a post saying that big oil distracts from their own carbon footprint by tricking you to focus on yours. And so throughout the, I'd say early 2000s to about 2015, in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, really, there was a lot of attention paid to individual consumers, especially on the topic of climate change, but also on overfishing, and not enough attention paid to global producers. And this was very much evident as well in the science itself. So the IPCC reports greenhouse gas emissions by sector. The IPCC publishes reports every 5 or so years, was established in 1988. This is the 2007 representation of greenhouse gases. You can see those sector-based emissions. Those are social choices as to how to attribute greenhouse gases, and that those sectors are again social choices that the scientists are making. And the graph on the right is just greenhouse gas emissions by country, and that is from 1997 here, but famously you can see, of course, US and China as the two largest current emitters, India third. And this is an important view of responsibility under the UN FCCC framework, our 1992 Global International Climate Policy, where we really think about responsibility at the nation state level. So the scientists are thinking about sectors. You can see there's some bleed between energy and transportation, for instance. Forestry and agriculture are not delineated very well in many of our minds. And then there's the idea of the nation state. Of course, we've already talked about individual responsibility. And then the kaleidoscope of science shifts, and the empirical evidence is looked at in another way. And in 2014, I would say a very important paper, at least for my own research, is published by Ricchetti, showing the greenhouse gas emissions by the investor and state-owned entities, by corporate actors. And you can see here just the top 13 or so companies on the list based on their 2010 emissions as well as their cumulative emissions. And this way of looking at the science has enormous ripple effects for how we view responsibility. These are often referred now to as the carbon majors. I think of them as the carbon dioxide majors for reasons that I will make clear in a moment. And just earlier this month, this work was updated, or last month, showing that half of the world's CO2 emissions come from just 36 fossil fuel firms. And you can see that the largest actors are state-owned entities like Aramco and Coal India. And then there are large investor-owned companies like ExxonMobil, the largest investor-owned fossil fuel company in the world, Chevron, Shell, BP. And of course, two of these are headquartered in the United States. Very important for the idea of legal responsibility. So I'm focused in this talk on moral responsibility, but we should also keep in the back of our mind legal and causal responsibility. These are all intertwined. Okay, so what makes an entity morally responsible for anything, but especially in this case for climate change, is that an entity, an individual, a company, a country, must have an adequate degree of or control of what they're doing. So we have to ask, were they acting freely? And do they have an epistemic state such that they can be held accountable for the action? Were they aware of what they were doing? And the epistemic conditions, the background knowledge, what did people know, how did they know it, how well did they know it? This is partly why some scientists have suggested differential responsibility for emissions that occur later in time, so that actually we are more responsible today for the emissions than we are for emissions that occurred in 1925. And they argue specifically for the start date of 1988 as an important sort of epistemic change, on the grounds that that's the year that Jim Hansen testifies in front of Congress about climate change. It's the year the IPCC was formed, and it's the year that climate change becomes observed and not just predicted in the models. That what the scientists said would happen, we see observed in global temperature. So that's one epistemic line in the sand, 1988. But here on the right, you have another graph from the Union of Concerned Scientists where they're looking at cumulative emissions by investor-owned companies, and they have these dashed lines, one at 1992, because that's when the UNFCCC framework came into effect, and one in 2016, because that's the year that the Paris Agreement was ratified. But you can think about these, about the epistemic conditions that come with each of these major knowledge events or policy events. I would argue that we gained major understanding about epistemic conditions in the year 2004, because that's the year that a very important paper came out, published by Naomi Oreskes, who was here at UC San Diego at the time, looking at the abstracts of almost 1,000 scientific papers at the time. She finds that 0% of these papers disagreed with the consensus position that greenhouse gases are accumulated in Earth's atmosphere. That there is widespread scientific consensus. There is not disagreement about anthropogenic climate change. She establishes this in 2004, and that same year, a paper that I teach alongside Naomi's paper comes out. Boykoff and Boykoff, they look at 636 articles in the prestige press that's influencing the American public. They find that 53% of articles give equal attention to the idea that climate change is man-made, as that climate change occurs due to just natural variation. So we have complete consensus, clarity in the scientific literature, and 50-50 chance in the prestige press that you would see that, modeled in the press. So there's a lot of doubt in the popular media in those epistemic conditions, and not a lot of doubt in the actual science. And alongside with that, we have the Pew famous studies of American belief that shows that almost half of Americans do not believe there's any evidence that human activity caused global warming. So again, the epistemic conditions, the background conditions are set. They're not the same as the science, and it's clear that the public is not where the scientists are, for instance. So anthropogenic climate change is not a result of, the belief in it is not a result of the state of the science. That's what I think is clear as of 2004 moving forward. Nor is it an issue that more science would solve. And that has been the view of many of us in academia, is to try to have more science, better science, clearer climate science. Instead, I want to argue it's an epistemic issue that involves communications, public relations. It's very distinct from an information gap. It's not as if we need to know more. It's always good to know more. But that the public misunderstanding is the result, perhaps, of distinct social forces beyond what the science has produced. So that you might have great empiricism on certain issues and very different epistemic conditions. And I include here some, hopefully you can see them, on the food front. So 26% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food. Many people don't know that. And the biggest offender in the food space for climate change is beef. That's the one listed here at the top. Beef has a disproportionate impact in terms of climate relative to any other food, even animal-sourced foods. And here on the right are the epistemic conditions, just a couple samples from the present, of Elon Musk saying that he's pro-environment, but he supports the farmers. Farming has no material effect on climate change. Here at the bottom, he says, this really needs to stop. Killing some cows doesn't matter for climate change. So we'll circle back to him because he's been recently pretty outspoken on the issue of animals and climate change in ways that I find interesting. So are there conditions for, or causes for these epistemic conditions? And I think by now almost everyone in this room thinks yes, there must be reasons that we have a differing in the public opinion from the science, a difference in the media from the science. Something's happening. And the question is what, and how can we show it? So this idea of Exxon knew comes out of Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting from Inside Climate News, and then is followed up with a series of studies, again led by Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran, who's now at the University of Miami, showing that not only that Exxon was aware of climate science, aware that it was going on, aware that it was about the findings, what it meant for their industry, but actually that it was conducting a lot of the science, funding a lot of the science, had some of those scientists working for Exxon internally. That is what Exxon knew is referring to. And some scientists have said, oh, that Exxon and other corporations like Total and Shell, they were aware of and in a position to understand the scientific data. In other words, they were aware of what they were doing. That's a precondition for moral responsibility. And they could have adapted their business models to this understanding. They were capable of acting freely. But the other thing that these scientists argue, from Hafidi and Oreskes, and I think is really important for today's talk, is that instead they sought to deny and disparage the science of climate change. And I would argue they helped create different epistemic conditions for the public. And this helped ensure the continued use of their products. Or assured their continued social license to operate, some people call it. So not only did Exxon know, but Exxon then lied, is the argument that has been made. One of the ways that they lied that has been most forensically studied is their use of advertorials or these paid opinion pages in prestige newspapers, especially the New York Times. They took out an advertorial every Thursday between 1972 and 2001. In 2016 dollars, it's about $31,000 an ad every week. They bought a quarter of all advertorials on the op-ed page in the Times. And not only have researchers shown experimentally that these ads do work to influence the public and increase issue salience, but others have speculated that because of the advertising, the New York Times itself may then shape the content of the newspaper to respond to its advertisers. And this has been sort of demonstrated in various ways. The other thing that's really important to note is that an analysis across Exxon documents, peer-reviewed internal documents, non-peer-reviewed reports, and then what you see on the far right, advertorials, there's just a vast difference in the amount of doubt in climate change expressed in the more public-facing documents than there is in the peer-reviewed literature, for instance. So again, showing this fissure between the epistemic conditions in the scientific literature and then in the more public-facing literature. And I'm referring to that as epistemic pollution rather than information pollution because it is largely disinformation, and so it's important to try to distinguish. Some people may not like the term epistemic pollution. I refer you to a really good lexicon of disinformation, misinformation, gaslighting, all the great words that are in the ether right now by Caroline Jacquet, the Department of Communications here. But here you can see an ExxonMobil advertorial that was run in, what year was this, 2007, emphasizing the individual consumer frame. Energy-saving consumers can make a real difference. And then this is just a regular opinion column in the Times by a staff writer that is published a couple weeks later on the carbon footprint and saving energy at home. And again, just to remind you, the half of America does not believe that global warming is anthropogenic or man-made at this point in time. So it's important at this point to just say Exxon knew, Exxon lied, but Exxon did not act alone. Many of the lawsuits that are currently underway in the United States against fossil fuel producers include many actors beyond Exxon. Companies like Shell Oil, again, have been implicated in the web of obstruction. Again, difficult to see here, I'm sorry, but I'm highlighting the corporations here. Total, Chevron, we've named already a few. But just to talk briefly about some of the other nodes in this network, because I want to lay the foundation to sort of ask how much meat and dairy looks the same, is we know that university scientists played a role in creating the epistemic conditions as well. Famously, again, Naomi Oreskes wrote this book, Merchants of Doubt, about how there's a handful of scientists in the 20th century that worked across a number of public issues, including climate change, and helped spread doubt and confusion about the scientific consensus. And a historian of science, Alan Brandt, has said that the tobacco industry sought experts with scientific pedigree, national standing, and a propensity for public conflict. And I also want to just put a pin in that because the 21st century looks very different. They also used, in the network of obstruction, a bunch of trade associations. Famously, the American Petroleum Institute in the United States is a big one. The Attorney General, the lawsuit here in this state against 5 of the largest fossil fuel companies that was filed last year includes API in the list of defendants. And it has been implicated in a whole variety of ways, has done a lot of the dirty work for creating doubt and confusion. Okay, public relations firms are another big part of the network. Again, this is a lot of work that's already been done. I'm just trying to piece it together here for this talk. A paper by Bob Brule and Cardi Worthman shows that Edelman is the most mentioned in the many documents from the fossil fuel industry they analyzed. And there have been calls now for about a decade to cut ties with Edelman to other kind of clients in the PR world because of the work it's done for fossil fuel companies, including Koch Industries too. Okay, So now we're shifting to the meat and dairy, because that's why you came, and that's why I'm here. And I'm more interested in that because it's unfolding in such interesting ways in real time. So to this point, I've really focused mainly, sort of, but not ad nauseum, I hope, on carbon dioxide. And as was mentioned, this is the sort of backbone of climate science at Scripps. And famously, the Keeling curve, which is updated regularly until maybe next week or whenever they plan to shut down Mauna Loa. There's half of, I mentioned the carbon majors or carbon dioxide majors too, this idea that 36 fossil fuel companies produce half of the world's CO2 emissions. And I don't want to distract from carbon dioxide. It's our most important, longest lived, most abundant greenhouse gas. But there are other greenhouse gases. They've been addressed by other researchers at Scripps, in fact, as well. And the one that interests me the most is methane, for a variety of reasons. And there was early work done in the late 1970s, early 80s by Ramanathan and by Paul Crutzen, who both are SAO scientists, on methane and as well as nitrous oxide. And the early climate science here is really interesting. This paper by Crutzen et al. Looks at methane production by both domestic animals, so that includes the meat and dairy industry, but also wild ruminants and other herbivorous fauna and humans. And it's sort of an early look at this kind of state of methane in the world. So that was published in '85. I just want to note that. And then, again, lots of interesting, very basic climate science. And that's just looking at what's out there in the world in terms of greenhouse gases, what kind of warming, and then we have to go to the source attribution. What part of it is human-caused? What part of it is natural? And you can see in the Crutzen paper, these two things are intertwined. But we start getting more sophisticated, of course, and then I already showed you this graph by the IPCC by sector. And then this graph on the right, maybe you can't see it very well, but it is methane emissions by sector. And that bright blue band at the bottom are agricultural emissions. And agricultural emissions account for the bulk of methane, human methane emissions, human-caused methane. And here the kaleidoscope shifts again, and the science intervenes, and it doesn't always even know where it's going. And I don't think the FAO considered this report as radical as it became. But it publishes in 2006 this report called Livestock's Long Shadow. How this came out of the FAO is sort of mind-boggling to me. But it is the first report to give a global estimate of the livestock sector emissions. It puts them at 18% globally. It still waffles around that number. And prior to that, there had been interesting climate work. I showed you some by Crutzen, but nothing had estimated the global animal agriculture contribution to climate change. If you look back here to this IPCC, again, they talk about agriculture as a whole and then forestry as its own lump, but animal agriculture specifically within those two categories accounts for 18%. That is a whole new way of looking at this climate change problem. And it included the feed production, the land use change, methane emissions, and just shifted our entire view of also responsibility for climate change. And the US beef industry knew this, although they were caught off guard, as many people seem to have been surprised by this FAO report. And here is an article in Top Producer by a cattleman calling the Livestock's Long Shadow report a public relations challenge. And he calls for a public relations program to address, my goodness, there are so many ways a good public relations program could help. He suggests that the US Beef Checkoff, which funds the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, start putting in some money to this public relations challenge. And indeed, there was a PR firm who got involved, the Center for Consumer Freedom. That's a front group for a PR firm called Berman & Co. And they start challenging Livestock's Long Shadow, the report. It took them a little bit of time to get things together. This press release comes out in March of 2009. The report came out in 2006. So they had to sort of get things together. And then, as my work has shown, they hired a university professor to, as you can see here, assessment of various environmental assessment of the livestock sector. So they are looking to fund a response to livestock's long shadow. They give a professor at UC Davis, Frank Mitloehner, $25,000 to do so. He publishes an article called Clearing the Air, Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change in the journal Advances in Agronomy. Hopefully you can see a little bit of that. And he makes a number of sort of, I would say sort of facile arguments about the report. One is that the 18% number does not apply to the United States, that here the number is much lower. Well, yes, that's like saying GDP per capita is much higher in the United States than it is globally. So he leans into that argument quite hard. And he also makes the argument that gets more traction in the media, which is that the Livestock's Long Shadow report looked at the sort of life cycle analysis or end-to-end accounting for the entire livestock sector. But when it compared it to transportation and it said it was greater than transportation, it had not done the same for the transportation sector. So while that didn't really fundamentally change anything about the absolutes, the report that he publishes here, the article he publishes, challenges that this is a larger sector than transportation, as had been reported in the media. But the press releases that were published as an account of this paper veer significantly from the publication. So the scientific paper reads fairly well, if not a little bit basic. And then the press releases, though, are framed completely differently than the work. Here's Don't Blame Cows for Climate Change, a press release that comes out from UC Davis, and then this one from the American Chemical Society, eating less meat and dairy products won't have a major impact on global warming. And the popular coverage, again, when we get from this kind of scientific epistemic condition to then the popular condition, looks really different. Fox News says eat less meat, reduce global warming, or not. Here you have scientists say don't blame cows for climate change. The UN body is going to look into the meat and climate link. And this is largely reported as a kind of debunking of livestock's long shadow. And Mitloehner is very much praised with grant money from the meat and dairy industry for this performance. And so we see this visible, and he's not alone, use again of the industry, of university and university expertise to help sort of, again, frame the doubt, the don't blame cows for climate change, challenge that causal link. So in shaping the epistemic conditions, we did a kind of forensic look, again, at the UC Davis Clear Center and the Colorado State University Ag Next Center. These are both created largely by the meat and dairy industries. It's hard to see here, but the main donation that gets the Clear Center off the ground is a $2.8 million grant from iFeeder, which is an arm of the feed industry. And then JBS is one of the big donors, the largest meat company in the world, headquartered in Brazil, to Ag Next. Mitloehner is the head of the Clear Center at UC Davis, and his student, Kim Stackhouse Lawson, is hired first at JBS as a sustainability officer and then into the position of full professor at Colorado State's Ag Next with 6 first author publications. She's made first a full professor. And she says, my day-to-day at CSU is not so different than what it was at JBS. In 2021, she gave at least 90 presentations, around 2 per week, on livestock sustainability. And Mitloehner has given about 800 presentations since he joined UC Davis, probably more, up around 900 now, since our reporting on this, since 2002. So I want to argue here that what the meat and dairy industry have done in this case is they created visible climate centers and climate expertise out of almost nothing. These are people that have PhDs in animal sciences. They are not trained in traditional climate science. They do not attend, or very often, I think Mitloehner actually has attended once, AGU. They don't have traditional, they don't publish in traditional climate journals. And they, Mitloehner has a dissertation focused on heat stress and feedlot dust. and he is referred to as a climate expert often, especially in the media. He lobbies various governments far beyond the United States, and he also has a very active social media presence, praised by the industry in documents about the Clear Center, and his Twitter handle, X handle, is Greenhouse Gas Guru. And so this is very distinct from the Merchants of Doubt, where it was looking for pedigree. I would argue in the 21st century, what they have shown in these cases is it's possible to create expertise without pedigree. And that in itself is interesting in terms of the epistemic conditions. So iFeeder gets the Clear Center off the ground with this gift of $2.8 million. It's an arm, again, of the American Feed Industry Association. And Cargill there is circled, but Elanco is part of it. The feed industry is part of the animal ag industry, and that often has been lost, including in the climate accounting. But there are other trade associations involved, and most of my work now focuses on this trade association, the NCBA, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, who I already mentioned had given the initial $25,000 to push back against livestock's long shadow. Tyson, the company that we've used in the title here, is a member of NCBA, along with Cargill, JBS, again, the largest meat company in the world, the National Beef and California Dairy. All these people or entities are members of NCBA. And prior to being NCBA, it was NCA. It merged with another livestock organization and became NCBA in 1996. Going through the archives, the NCA archives in Laramie, Wyoming, we found evidence that NCA, like American Petroleum Institute, has challenged the existence of climate change. Here you can see they're saying no global warming threat. This is in the beef brief. Many scientists question whether there is a global warming threat. No, they don't. But in any event, the cattle industry does not pose a threat in terms of emission of methane. And so you can see here what they're really doing is challenging that causal link, which you see much more in meat and dairy than you do in the American Petroleum Institute and the petroleum industry, where they challenged climate change outright, not the causal link so much between fossil fuels and climate change. Okay, so now we turn to the attribution science, where again we have the twisting of the kaleidoscope, and we have this view of methane majors, we could call them, the meat and dairy companies who are most responsible for climate change in the United States, the largest meat and dairy companies in the world that again represent, what percentage is it that these 35 represent? I can't remember, but the top 5 meat and dairy companies, their emissions are larger actually than ExxonMobil's. So that puts them in perspective for those state-owned companies versus investor-owned. And you can see here Tyson Foods is the second one. It's the second largest meat company in the world. And Marfrig and JBS are the 2 largest beef companies in the world, both headquartered in Brazil. So these methane majors are important because methane is a more potent but shorter-lived greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And a lot of people have argued that methane is our sort of where we have to put the pedal to the metal this decade, and last decade, and the decade before that, and the decade before that. Okay, so we asked about these 10 largest meat and dairy companies. This work wasn't done by us. We used the work of a group called IATP and Grain to dig into these 35 companies. And we looked very closely at the 10 largest meat and dairy companies in the United States, and we found that they were engaged in shaping the social conditions, the epistemic conditions, very much in the same way that fossil fuel companies were, although not every company to the same degree. And some of them have lobbied, for instance, a lot more on climate issues than others. So Exxon spent over $240 million, for instance, on lobbying the government, and this is not just on climate change. You can't really pull out just climate change, but just generally. And over that same time period, Tyson only spent $25 million, but as a percentage of revenue, Tyson spent double what Exxon has on political campaigns, 33% more on lobbying. These are more political companies in some ways than fossil fuel companies. They lobbied against Kyoto, they lobbied against cap and trade, they lobbied against the Clean Power Plan. They were active on climate salient issues. And just as Exxon did not act alone in the network of climate obstruction, so too did the meat and dairy companies not act alone. But I want to get back to this question of what Tyson knew, and did Tyson know anything the way that Exxon did, and how? So we know that Tyson did not employ climate scientists to work for the company the way that ExxonMobil did, or that's, to the best of our knowledge, the case. They weren't likely funding a bunch of independent, really great climate scientists at elite universities. But we have now found evidence in the archives that they were aware of climate change. And one of the ways we know this is through this document. This is public, the 1989 document from the EPA. It was about a meeting that was attended in February of 1989, and the report's published in August 89. And what's interesting about this report is it has as an appendix that Crutzen study that I mentioned from earlier about the methane production by ruminant animals and domestic animals. And the report's covered in the New York Times. It gets all this attention, and they say, just as I just said about this decade, of all the greenhouse gases, methane may be the easiest to control and one of the most important to address in this decade. They mention that quite a bit in the article. And you can see they're talking about methane from the guts of livestock. So Richard Neal was at this meeting. He's from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. He was there at the EPA. And the EPA report doesn't say anything about what to do about this. It doesn't. It talks about how to add feed additives, but doesn't address any of the consumer side of things. It doesn't say we should change our diet or anything like that. But a lot of civil society groups picked up on this EPA report. And they said, and other science that was happening, and they said, well, you know, maybe we should change our diet on account of this scientific knowledge. And this Greenhouse Crisis Foundation said, here's 101 things people could do, and number 4 on the list was change your diet. Now, the NCA also met in May, June, and July of 1989, and then they produced a 17-page strategic plan. This is what we found in the archives, the strategic plan on the environment. And at that meeting, same year, right after the NCA initial meeting, was Rick Neal, the same guy that was in the EPA meetings, was in the strategic planning for the environment meeting. And here's at the penultimate page of this report shows that what are the environmental issues that most impact the cattle industry? Well, here's number 22, atmospheric emissions. It's clear as day in their report. And they also have, it's a long report, well, 17 pages, and they also highlight the role of the Greenhouse Crisis Foundation, that they need to set the record straight here. They need to make people aware that this is misinformation, and they need to commission position papers by leading scientific and technical experts on their claims about the environmental impacts of the cattle industry. So they're getting ready to, again, change the epistemic conditions of the public. And in the face of getting ready to do that, a book comes out called Beyond Beef, 1992, by the same guy who led the Greenhouse Crisis Foundation, Jeremy Rifkin. And with it, he has a large campaign. It was not a radical campaign. It was seen as really mainstream because large environmental groups were involved, like Rainforest Action Network, I think Sierra Club, mainstream groups. And he had an op-ed in the Times. He had lots of newsletters, of course, the book and a book tour. And here's a full-page advertorial that he took out in the New York Times about reducing beef consumption by 50%. That was his goal, not to end meat consumption, not to turn America vegan, but to reduce beef consumption specifically by 50%. We now also know and have documented sort of ad nauseum the industry response to this campaign and others related to dietary change. And one of the things that the beef industry did, they had this Don't Blame It on Bossy campaign, and they also hired the public relations firm, Edelman, along with Burson Marsteller, to offer reporters free trips to Wyoming cattle ranchers, thick packets of pro-beef material, and they had a really big counter-campaign. They shut down, as you'll see in the next paragraph, Rifkin's book tour, essentially, by creating such a backlash. And so, again, Edelman, who is present in the climate obstruction by fossil fuel companies, is present in the meat and dairy companies as well. And here I'm wrapping up to bring us to the present moment with people I'm sure we're all fans of in this room. Joe Rogan and Elon Musk talking last year on his podcast, they're saying, Rogan's saying it's crazy talk. Nowadays, it's like you have to say we have to eat less meat. That meat's bad. And Musk says, totally, eat as much meat as you want. It's not going to make a difference. And if somebody says it does make a difference, I'm like, how will you measure it? And if you can't even measure it, then it's bullshit. Okay. So we tried to measure it. And we just published this in ERL, and it's, I'm calling it the harmless beefeater scenario after Parfit. So we have a bunch of harmless beefeaters, and they decide to cut their beef consumption in half as a result of Rifkin's campaign in 1992. What if we had done that? Was the problem overdetermined? Could we have made a difference? And we can't do everything counterfactually that we would want to. But we were able to, with Gideon Eschel's food models, look at what this would have meant just within the United States. And again, it depends on the metrics you're using because methane has stronger warming potential, but it's shorter lived. So if you use GWP 20, you actually get greater effect than if you use GWP 100. But somewhere between 5 to 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent could have been averted under that scenario. And a single year of cutting beef consumption in half would have reduced emissions by as much as 24 to 80 years of the average, 80 times, it should say, 24 to 80 times of the average US methane emission reduction efforts that occurred over that time period. So mostly that was around fossil fuels, tightening leaks around leaky pipes. And if enough of us had acted differently, we together could have made the outcome better, is the argument of this paper. And a large potential reason that this did not happen was a concerted obstruction campaign by the meat and dairy industry in ways, again, that we could get into in depth. But I think the main thing to take home here that I find so fascinating is this huge divergence then in the rhetorical frames used by these two industries, where on the one hand, Exxon emphasizes consumer responsibility over and over again, as did other oil and gas companies. They use the rhetoric of consumer demand. They talk about how energy-saving consumers can make a real difference. They lean into individual responsibility. But the meat and dairy industry want you to believe that individual responsibility is a trick. This is why Mitloehner is saying big oil distracts from their carbon footprint by tricking you to focus on yours. He is writing from the meat and dairy industry perspective, saying they want you to think you can make a difference, but you can't. And he writes, giving up meat won't save the climate. And I myself, who had believed that individual responsibility was a bad frame, that it was a rhetorical device by industry, that it could not make a difference, that it came at the expense of systemic action, have now questioned whether or not that's really true on the basis of this large obstruction campaign run by this specific polluting sector of our society. So hopefully I've laid out some of the network of climate obstruction by the meat and dairy industry, how similar they are to the oil and gas industry. And I just thought I would walk you through a few of the concluding points because I think it was hopefully, I was trying to piece together various arguments about moral philosophy or our epistemic conditions and who's responsible, as well as just the sort of nuts and bolts of the actual differences between these two polluting sectors. So the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change and their role in it, and so did meat and dairy, but they did not know about it in the same way, through the same avenues, through the same channels. They both created doubt about the existence, but not to the same degree. I think meat and dairy industry they leaned more into the question of causation, less about the existence of climate change. The merchants of doubt are very different between these two industries, in part because the meat and dairy industry is operating in a very different epistemic environment, and they are able to create expertise more easily than the fossil fuel industry was back in the 20th century. Hard to feel nostalgic, but one does. Distinct from oil and gas, meat and dairy, they do not like the rhetoric of individual responsibility. And this to me is one of the most, for me, has challenged one of my core beliefs about the way the world works. They both have shaped epistemic conditions, and in the case of meat and dairy, the disinformation that they put out may have prevented Americans from making one of the easiest, readily available, and effective climate actions, changing what they eat. And this may represent, in some ways, a sort of different form of legal harm. And for that reason, I think moral philosophy and practical ethics should give more consideration to the entities who shape epistemic conditions, and not just ask what were the epistemic conditions that they were operating under, but how did they shape those for others. I just want to acknowledge the huge number of people who helped with this talk, and especially the American Heritage Center, where the archives live for the National Cattlemen's Association. May they please allow me access next week when I go. And also to just mention a few of the key references for the papers. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Hear that? Thank you very much for that great talk. We have some time for questions. So if you could raise your hand and I'll give you a microphone.
Thanks, that was really great. So it seemed at the start we had the sort of fossil fuel producing big gas and energy companies pushing individual responsibility, and then it's the meat and dairy saying individual responsibility is bad. So I guess that's painting a confusing picture for me. Should I understand that individual responsibility then doesn't have much of an effect for gas and energy and does for meat and dairy, or does it have an effect across the board and these are just sort of one of them's making a mistake? How should I understand the relationship between this changing the epistemic environment and our individual responsibility across the sectors?
Yeah, I really like that, and I'm still working through that as well. But we make the argument that it's context and action specific. So in many ways, the individual action and responsibility they encourage is also very marginal. It's about turning off the lights. It's about carpooling to work, upgrading appliances. You don't see them encouraging the installment of solar panels. Or you also are aware of the hard-won battles by fossil fuel companies to keep electric vehicles and car companies to keep electric vehicles off the road. So I think it's very action-specific as to what they really mean by individual responsibility. But I think that we should all get to that level of granular detail to understand. And diet is more straightforward, right? Because it's really, decisions you're making 3 times a day. There's a lot of elasticity in the choices that you're making. I think that diet is more straightforward, and when it comes to fossil fuel companies, there's a lot more nuance to the kinds of choices that they're actually pushing forward, and that you would see that level of pushback. In fact, we did around solar panel installation. But again, that action only happens, maybe once or twice in your lifetime.
Okay, sorry. One of the questions that I had was about how in the beginning for the fossil fuel industry, you said that individual responsibility made people not want to do it. So then if the meat and dairy industry said, don't eat meat, then wouldn't that make them eat more meat in a reverse way?
So the study that I referenced, I think you're referring to the second one, where it was talking about how if you ask people to do something with regards to individual responsibility, then they will, for instance, have less of a belief in anthropogenic climate change. And I think that's something we all have to contend with as a sort of potential psychological factor, right? I mean, I think that's sort of getting to the heart of any form of denial. When you say that this belief system then would make you, right, have to sort of sacrifice something, you may give up the belief system that would generate that kind of behavior. So we have to understand the risks there in terms of that kind of decision making. And what I think is present there that I haven't thought deeply enough about, but is that the oil industry was getting a double whammy when they were emphasizing consumer responsibility and turning off the lights. In a way, I think they were helping fuel the doubt that they were also pandering on in other places. Because by asking consumers to take responsibility, if we believe this single study, and we may not want to, we may want to gather more evidence, but it could also then be leading to less belief in anthropogenic climate change. And I think the question is, well, what if Greenhouse Crisis Foundation or Beyond Beef, would that have the same effect? By asking Americans to eat 50% less beef for climate, would you actually then help lower the belief in anthropogenic climate change because people are so wedded to the beef that they're eating? And those are legitimate questions and, rebound effects, and I think, serious concerns of any social campaign.
Is it working? Yeah. I'm following up on the same line of thinking. I heard Bill McKibben speak in about 2000, and his advice was, tell people how they can help, don't make them wrong. And I feel like you've given us examples of how the oil and gas told people how they could help, even if it was in tiny little ways. And the beef industry was suddenly wrong, and people are so protective of our farmers that, I just wonder if it could have been something as slight as that made the difference. But great talk, thank you.
Yeah, I think that while at the same time diet in some ways is easier, immediately available, it potentially has a way bigger impact. Culturally, it has also very different significance than oil and gas even. And so it's politically just a very exciting, if you want to be positive about it, space to analyze.
Is this? Okay, it is on. Thank you. I think this was a really great talk. I'm curious, I don't think Mitloehner is creating and maintaining expertise by himself. How complicit do you think UC Davis is in allowing him to be funded and have this platform?
No. Initially, the paper we wrote really was focused in the same way that Merchants of Doubt was on these individuals. And as it took shape and more, it became clear that the universities do play a role in creating these epistemic conditions and creating this expertise. What we argue in the paper is that this is much more like a PR center operating out of a university than it is a scientific center. If you look at outputs, for instance, no scientific publication acknowledges the CLEAR Center. Thanks the CLEAR Center for funding. And so I think there are clear ways that universities can look, we're in crazy epistemic situation, and universities are what we have, and I think it's really important in many ways. The playbook was written as an homage to science, and in many ways that paper was really about thinking so much about the role of universities and really wanting to protect universities as a place of genuine epistemic inquiry, production, knowledge production, not disinformation production. So yeah, there is a role there. On the other hand, it would be hard to manufacture that out of nothing. He has some very special characteristics, as did the Merchants of Doubt. I mean, I think what's interesting is that in some ways the universities get more play in our paper than they do, for instance, in Merchants of Doubt. that somehow they've become more relevant or maybe more, they have sort of a stronger relationship somehow to industry, the university itself, than the individual actors in this century, and that is a little puzzling and beyond my, pay grade at this point. But yeah, the universities have a role to play. In part, though, also with meat and dairy, this is something I should mention, is because these are public land grants institutions, they're much more susceptible to FOIA requests. If we could do the same for oil and gas, we may find really interesting gift agreements with Stanford, with Princeton. These private universities are protected and shielded from some of the inquiries that have allowed us to understand what's going on at Colorado State and UC Davis in ways that private universities aren't. So I sympathize with the public university's position there for sure.
Mika, ask my question. Thank you. This was super interesting. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, but I don't see you.
Oh, I'm right here.
There.
Yeah. This was super interesting, and my question may or may not lie outside your scope. Forgive me if it is the case. But as climate conscious individuals, what should our demands be from big meat and big dairy? And I think it gets a little tricky because concerns to mitigate climate change might be in tension with other concerns. Like, for instance, moving an operation that raises animals on pasture land to like a CAFO factory farm might be better from an emissions perspective, but it would come at the cost of animal welfare. So I guess that's a two-part question. What should our demands be, and how should we frame those in a way that takes care of these seemingly competing moral considerations?
I mean, if I had the answers to that question, like what should we be doing? I think, I guess my takeaway here, at least, is that these are polluting companies or sectors who have not only shaped the physical environment, but also the social one. And if we fail to acknowledge that, I feel like we will fail to act in a way that is the most effective. So I don't know exactly the most efficient way forward, but it feels to me like failing to understand the epistemic conditions will not allow us to act in a way that's most effective or where we most want to go. In both cases, at least, let's say, for both meat and dairy and oil and gas, I do think they are in a position of existential crisis in terms of the actual companies. They saw that the writing was on the wall. It's no surprise to see these tactics coming from the beef industry specifically. It's not surprising because beef really is like the coal of fossil fuels is sort of the beef position. And I think it's interesting that we sort of accept, or at least to date have accepted, that when these companies are sort of pushed into this position, well, we just expect them. They're really just performing their fiduciary duty in these cases. That feels really problematic, that your fiduciary duty says that you should educate third graders that beef is an essential part of the American culture, way of life, and doesn't harm the climate or water, or, that should hopefully, trigger something in our society, I think, to protect knowledge in the same way that we would want to protect the environment or our waterways or our atmosphere. So I think we should think about epistemic pollution and carbon pollution sort of at the same time.
Hi, I speak coming from the perspective of a first-year undergrad. I think people in my age period, and it's pretty much widely agreed upon that we're kind of going through this epidemic of we're on social media and we're constantly bombarded by sources, And the distinction you drew between the empirics and the epistemics, when we see the data, when we see the statistics, and we see the facts on, Twitter or like any other social media that's particularly politically polarizing in that nature, how can we as young people critically think and critically make our own distinctions so that the entities that are trying to like make that epistemic blur to make us into climate skeptics, and how can we really jump out of that to really critically think about the things we're exposed to?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. You'll probably have a lot of better ideas than I do because I'm not using these tools regularly. But we were talking about this in the disinformation reading group the other day, and it came up, about the loss of fact checkers at Facebook or X or various places, right? They've let them go. And I am of the mind, and maybe this is wrong, but that it's a great thing, actually, that these platforms should erode to the totally unreliable places that they deserve to be, and that we should be paying a premium for good information. This is not unlike other epistemic times in our lives or in human history. And so I think the aligning yourself with a media source that is trustworthy, that actually has fact checkers. I've started sort of in my mind sort of getting glib about people who call themselves reporters but aren't fact checked. Like maybe we don't allow that in the same way that we don't allow PR people to call themselves reporters. Maybe we start having much stronger standards about, and I'm just totally off the cuff here, but I really do worry and think about these issues as well, and media literacy, but it's about sort of aligning yourself or your information environment with reliable sources rather than just tabloids. If you just read the National Enquirer when I was growing up, you also wouldn't be very well informed. And so, you had to sort of have sources you knew that were reliable and you could trust. And now, of course, with AI, and everyone's talking about all of this stuff all the time. I know it's just a fire hose of information, and we're drowning in it. But it feels to me, again, if we don't consider this alongside the actual physical pollution, that we will not win.
Thank you. Excellent talk, and thank you very much for being here and doing this. I really appreciate it. So the question earlier was about UC Davis and essentially their, if you will, complicity in allowing this campaign to go on. I have a similar, earlier in your talk, you said the New York Times had been accepting advertorials.
Yeah.
And how that, in some ways, you just briefly touched on, may have sparked some of their coverage later. Well, I'm looking at one of your papers that you recently wrote. It says the animal agriculture industry, U.S. universities, and the extraction, of climate understanding and policy have, do you have any ideas of doing a similar paper towards the mainstream media?
Yes, actually. It's really good. If you go back to this network of obstruction, you see conservative media maybe up there in the far right, and that actually should be, it's not, to your point about 21st century, it's not conservative media anymore. It's all media all the time because everyone also has these ad-based revenue models. And so there's a lot of incentivizing sort of certain positions. And yes, that's well understood to some extent with the prestige media about, the different newspapers have always had different sort of political leanings and positions. And some would argue, oh, that's just the New York Times sort of neoliberal model. It was always compatible. It shaped the advertorials more than the advertorials shaped it. But there's some kind of relationship there is all that I would like to claim. And I think the really important study to be done, of course, is around the media's treatment of the causal role of meat and dairy and climate change. And there's been some little gray reports done on that, but nothing peer-reviewed yet. So that's certainly another shoe to drop. If you are looking for work, you always need RAs.
Thank you for your talk. It was super fascinating. I'm a little bit nervous because this is a question that kind of hits close to home. I was part of a student group last year in the summer who used FOIA requests and kind of publicly available data to investigate the ties our own university has to the fossil fuel industry, and we actually found out that there's a lot. So there's a lot of funding from Shell and BP and Exxon Mobil coming to these universities, funding researchers. There's a lot of partnerships. There was this Exxon Mobil worker coming to campus wanting to recruit students, and we kind of concluded this report saying that this should be highly alarming, and you have been showing us as well that universities play a huge role in kind of forming the beliefs that we hold as a society, and I was wondering if you think that UCSD has the moral responsibility to cut these ties, especially knowing how the fossil fuel industry has been using these relationships in the past and might be using them now as well.
Well, again, I'd like to say that we know more about what this university is doing than MIT because of those FOIA laws. And so in some ways, I don't love that the public universities pay a bigger price and they already paid the price because they are public universities and not the private Ivies, for doing the work that the Ivies have been doing for decades. I mean, that's an issue of transparency. The other thing, I mean, a lot of people have argued, and Craig has thought about this a lot more than I have, but about transparency policies and the role of disclosure and leading a lot of work here at UCSD. But there's an argument, Dale Jamieson has made it, and so it's a kind of more middle of the road than maybe some of us would take, but that a lot of people are not going to agree with the kind of funding I get in a university. Maybe some people would say that was sort of loaded with different kinds of values. I think there's a distinction between industry money and non-industry money, definitely. And that at the very beginning, we can have some kind of standards to delineate that kind of money and what it involves, and we can have much better transparency and disclosure at the university level. Past that, the question of banning fossil fuels monies has been brought up in the same way that tobacco, that's what happened with tobacco. They wanted to ban tobacco money. That was only sort of semi-successful, but it was part of this much bigger push about the social license to operate. Do I want to see meat and dairy funding ended? It's like, no, not all of it is related to climate change. A lot of it's just like, how do we make more eggs from one chicken? So it would be very hard to, sort of end that sort of writ large. In other words, it's hard to think about a kind of sector-based approach to funding. But I am all for what could at the minimal happen is more transparency and disclosure. And that would include, I would think, that the Ivy Leagues would have to step up there as well. That the public universities should not be the only schools bearing the brunt of this. And the faculty pushing for that within those schools, I think, really should be supported by professors elsewhere, too.
Maybe this is desperate searching for a silver lining, but I'm wondering if you've thought about or are interested in looking into the extent to which these two different epistemic approaches might undermine each other. Yeah. So, I mean, you touched on the fact that they have different approaches to whether climate change exists at all, yeah. Or man-made climate change. But then also, it seems that if dairy and beef are really successful at telling us that our individual choices don't matter, well, then that makes us skeptics of fossil fuel claims. Or alternatively, if they're really good at making us think that our individual actions matter, well, that seems like that could create a lot more flexitarians.
Yeah. And not only that, but the meat and dairy industry singles out the fossil fuel industry all the time. They talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, it's fossil fuels, they're always sort of aiming. What I'm hoping to see this decade is the fossil fuel companies say, wait, this is our methane moment. We need to go after, the Exxon campaign against Tyson. which I think is, it's sort of actually scary to imagine, because then again, we live in this kind of epistemic, very confusing situation. But you could easily imagine a scenario. We have not seen fossil fuels go after meat and dairy. And if they put their hundreds of millions that they put into challenging the existence of climate change into, don't worry with our fossil methane. We should be focusing on non-fossil methane. And this will get us where we need to go. It would be sort of exhilarating, and a lot would happen. But so far, nothing really has materialized. And it's interesting because the same PR firms are working for both sectors. So this is what the document said. Well, I'm looking like, what is Edelman doing? They're saying, that individual choice doesn't matter. It's a little bit of their own kind of confusion as well that I think would be really interesting, just research. But yeah, I look for those synergies. I know you're good at that too in the legal environment.
So we're unfortunately out of time. There's a reception outside there for everyone to join and continue the conversation. But before we do that, I'd like to thank one last time Jennifer Jacquet. Thank you.
Could you even see the slides? I could not see them.